right now. I'm going to attempt to cram kind of like 3 months of information in one session. I thought you probably, a lot of people have agriculture background, supply chain background, more than computer science background. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go quickly on the background of what we have here before we proceed to the rest of them. Stop me if I'm going too fast. My plan is to go very fast with it and then bring it all together at the end, have some questions for you and go from there.
Excellent.
All right, so what we are going to do right now is understand the problem, and then like the basic question is, what's machine learning anyway? And if it is that, a lot of people say machine learning versus artificial intelligence, what's the difference between those? And then what is IoTs anyway? And do we have to add blockchain in this? And then at the end, we'll conclude, okay, you've been torturing us for 30 minutes. Now, where is the beef in all of this stuff? So the problem that we have right now is that agriculture, food, and related industries is a big sector of what we do. Some estimates say it's about, it's a huge amount, like 20% of GDP in the USA. It's $1.05 trillion so far that is counted there. By the way, a lot of the information here, you can find it on the web. I try to put in the links to those when I can, just so that you can fact check what I'm saying. So it's a big sector. A lot of people work in it, and also we all depend on them. Ag is a basic need for everybody that is living on this planet. And then the IoT market is growing rapidly. So it's growing from about 13 billion in there to about 21 billion by the end of the next couple of years. There. So that's growing. So there must be something with it that we need to understand why it is. And then AI by itself, in terms of business spend, is headed towards 36 billion in spend and opportunities by 2025 there. So those are fields that are very, very rapidly moving. So, however, Gartner predicts that up to 85% of AI projects will fail. Why is that? Why do we fail in a lot of those projects? Because you have to understand that ag is basically another part of an AI project or an IoT project or in general a technology project in there. So the big problem with that is that we don't really understand it and understand how it is implemented. So when we try to create something out of thin air, it does not really work. Why is that? So from myth to math, we need to understand what it is. A lot of people think of it as it's magical. It's just angels will install AI out of the box and it will solve everything for me. The other people are thinking, no, it's the Terminator model where you basically gonna come in, take away my decision-making capabilities and so forth there. It's neither both. It's just another tool. It's based on mathematical models of how we look at the data and how we interpret the data coming there. So, so that's kind of like we need to separate those two pictures and we need to understand how do we start with those and how do we work with those. So where do we start with all of these? So the first thing that we need to understand with AI in general is basically that I machine in there is like AI is basically an ability for a system to reason with you. What do I mean by this? Logical reasoning, there are several types of them. The big description for those or the two different categories in them are basically either deductive or inductive in there. And in each one of them, you're trying to apply logical constructs to understand whether the statement is true or not true. Is it valid or invalid? Is it strong or is it weak? Is it sound, unsound, or is it cogent or uncogent? So that's the fundamental basic look of like how do you basically jump from pure data into creating or deducing information out of it. In there is my professor back at NC State usually said there's a proverbial logic machine that you insert all the data in it and then watch how the states change from one aspect to the other. But how can a machine learn from all of this stuff? So machine learning is basically a step forward from statistics in there. So in the sense of when you are programming something, you always have to do conditional trees and so forth. It's like if, then do that, if, then do that. So you have to describe everything explicitly for the program to execute on it correctly for you. However, learning means that instead of explaining everything, you can create more generic rules that can learn from behavior of people or a data set that has been tagged. So kind of like think about how do people usually learn for kids and so forth. You tell them, look, here is how you do it the right way, here is do it the wrong way, instead of saying, here are the steps. That's the basic difference between machine learning and statistics in general. So then how does that differ from artificial intelligence in there? Those two words are being used a lot and mixed up with each other. Machine learning by itself is the ability of a machine to learn new patterns, but the artificial intelligence is simulation of human brain functions, meaning that it actually can give you decisions back and adapt to those. That sounds so scary, but so far we haven't been able of creating that general AI. Usually we are working with something called narrow AI. Narrow AI means using the machine learning, which uses the logic reasoning, will be able of ingesting a domain-specific knowledge base, a very curated amount of data that allows you to look through a certain lens and a certain piece of that domain. And based on that, you would create that intelligence that allows you to make some decisions there. Artificial intelligence basically allows you to learn new patterns as you go. So unlike machine learning, where you basically define the learning pattern, this one opens it up even further. So not only you don't have to tell it the steps, but you also don't have to tell it the variants around all of those pieces, if that makes sense. So, but again, what we are trying to do here, so what's the end result? It's all a lot of talk, but we want to have a concrete result of what is going on and how do we set all of the stuff. The simplest thing to think about machine learning and AI is to think about a classification problem. And in classification problems, you would have three basic types of it. Is it either binary classification model, means black and white? Is it like, for example, are the lights on? Are the lights off? Is the irrigation system turned on? Is it turned off? Did you finish going through the packing or not? In there, do you see fruit on the tree or not? So that's a decision, binary one. That's an easier problem to go because you have an easier space. Then there is multi-class classification model, in which you start going into a plethora of those, in the sense of, you know, like we have different options in color. So it's black, white, green, blue, and so forth. Or think about it as you are trying to scan a field to see the infections in the crop. Some areas are infected, some areas are not, but there are areas in between. So you would have to assess the degree of that in still a discrete amount of classifications in it. The hardest part would be regression models. So regression models deal with a continuous amount of data, means your result is a continuous result. So for example, predicting the temperature is very, very hard because it's not either 90 degrees or 85 or 80. There is a whole plethora of degrees in between. Predicting the weather patterns. when I was working in research at NC State, there was like the supercomputer lab that was basically trying to use supercomputer to predict weather patterns, not on only macro level, but micro levels in there. So how do you get to those little pieces there? How do you figure out the data in it? And it is continuous. So why do we have to care about those different parts? Because each one of them requires a totally different amount of data and a totally different look at what the data is. So think about AI as basically a child that is trying to learn, that needs data to learn. And each of those classification models, the more the decisions you have to make, the more examples you have to show to the AI, the more that it has to see examples of those. Otherwise, it's just basically an if-else statement in there, but it needs to hydrate something internally. What is that something that it's trying to hydrate? It's a model. So what I want to shift your mind here, it's not about the data and computation on the data, but it's basically the model, that brain inside the AI that you are trying to shape with different examples in there. How do you go about that? You have to clean the data. You have to remove the noise from it. You have to split it into a training set, a testing set, and a validation set. Validation itself has different types of validation: cross-validation, in-fold validation, Monte Carlo validations, all of that. And you have to pick an algorithm. Algorithm is basically the type of brain that you will let it learn. Sometimes you would need to kind of like go through different multiple algorithms to figure out which one would fit the current model. Unlike us humans, where your brain is a general AI, you can basically see any problem, and with enough time and resources, you probably will be effective in solving it. AI is not there yet because we can't basically process all of the different data and all different examples and work through it. A big example of that is Watson. So it needs to ingest the domain-specific data. The more data you give it, the harder it will be able of learning, and the less confidence in the answer it will bring you there. But what about those algorithms there? Kind of like, so this is going to be like a huge topic. I'm going to basically touch on the base. But in machine learning, there are three different types: supervised, unsupervised, and reinforcement in there. The reinforcement is particularly interesting because supervised, you basically give it a certain tasks and you supervise what's going on with it. The unsupervised is data-driven. You look at, here are the different data that comes from the field. I don't have a particular task there, but I need you to learn from those. And when you see the same pattern coming in, you'd classify it one way or the other. In the reinforcement, that's where you are trying to react to new data coming in. So you have to, like something that you have not seen before, and you cannot put it in one bucket or the other. So it's basically, think of it as rewriting their own software to grow. The machine learning algorithms are a whole plethora of different families, ranging between KNN, nearest neighbor, or neural networks, random forests, and a whole plethora of them. There are probably like close to 100 of those different ones. Why do they differ? Because if you take it and disassemble it, get to the root of it, you'll see that each one of them, there was a bazillion different approaches to choose from. The probabilistic models underneath it that was used to construct this specific model, there are assumptions that were made to fit a certain classification or a class of data. Is it using normal distribution, using Dirichlet distribution? And there is a whole plethora of those that have been built there. None of them fit all solutions. So you have to look through all of these. So what is the simplest part? So let's take, like, all of that is too complex. I want you to get out of this session understanding in an essence, how do you work with classification and how do you work with machine learning? So this picture here shows you how SVM works. SVM is called support vector machine. And you basically give it a space with different balls, blue and red. And what you're trying to do is to determine a line in between. So you want to draw a line in the sand and say, okay, how do I separate those? Why I'm doing that? So in the training time, you are trying to see, can I get this line in a distance between the different balls here so that it's equally separated in between, and you keep moving the line back and forth until you get to this distance and set it up. And then that's the training part. Then you remove all those balls and the model is ready to go into the testing phase, where you basically take that one and throw a ball at it. If it falls to the left of the line dividing it, it becomes a blue ball. If it falls to the right of it, it becomes a red ball. That's how the algorithm use your data to set up the line and work from it there. In a little bit more complex view of that, then if there's only one line separating the two different pieces, that's in 2 dimension. But as you go into 3 dimension, it becomes a hyperplane, which means a line is much easier to draw. A plane requires more data to figure. And also, we picked a simple straight line. However, if you want to get more predictions, you have to make it a curve, which means the plane would be a curve as well, which requires much more data in order for it to learn. Much more data, much more things to learn, much more computational power in all of that stuff. So, and usually how like the life of PyAI kind of thing is acquires data, learns from data, predicts, and then refine all of that stuff. So this is the cycle that you would want to see in a system that allows you from learning from all of those. So now what about those things that you're saying, Internet of Things in there? So Internet of Things are basically simply things connected to the internet. So think of them as anything from your Wi-Fi enabled toaster to kind of like a satellite system that is monitoring all of that. If it is connected to the internet, if there is an identifier on it, you can reach to it. In the last years, we had a lot of devices in the home, cameras, automatic lock, opening Nest, and a lot of monitoring securities, things that would check if your water is open or not. All of those are IoTs. Anything that can be connected to the internet is basically an IoT in here. An IoT comes in all shapes and sizes. So they are used to collect the data. Those are basically the on-ramps of the AI. That's why I wanted to explain the problem around why AI needs data. Without data, AI cannot learn, and you cannot just program it in it. The best way is to link it to other pieces in there. So now let's get to like IoT plus AI plus agriculture. So in agriculture, to a computer science view, you have a whole ton of data parameters coming through all of the system, from the weather, from the water condition, from the soil condition, from the time of the year that is going on, type of crops that you are doing reports about, insects and so forth there. And what we are trying to do with all of these is to use IoTs to collect data in the field, feed it into an AI system to learn all of that stuff, so that we can improve on the agricultural output in there, so that we can make the farming life much easier, as well as the consumer aspects of it. But that requires us to think about one small other thing. When we are trying to collect all of this data coming in, now farms are not like in the middle of the city. They are in a rural area. Probably internet connection is not there. And think about it from simple farms like a half-hectare coffee farm on the top of San Pedro de Sula in Honduras, or 500 hectare farm in Texas. All of those have one thing in common. They don't have a lot of internet coverage in there. So how do you make an Internet of Things work when there is no internet there? That's where edge computing comes in play. So in edge computing, what it says is, instead of getting all this information from the different farms and IoTs on the farm into a central location for it to be processed, what we're going to do is give enough capabilities and reasoning down the stream, out towards the edge. So in some instances, in the farm, you'd have a computer unit that connects all of those IoTs to it, and it does pre-processing and then pushes it up. In some other aspects, your IoTs themselves can be a little bit smarter. So instead of just a sensor, it would be a sensor with some computing power that allows to do part of the processing on the chip itself for the IoT, and then push that result to the computer on the farm, which completes more and pushes it up the stream, which computes it even more. And that allows you to do things like cross farms right on the local level of understanding how that would work in there. So then what we need to come up here is AI works with the data if the data is secure and if the data is true. If you feed the AI model wrong data or data that is not correct, the AI will learn those data and then it will become biased. One interesting anecdote around that is the MIT did a study. So they took two sets of data, one that was murder scene photos, the other one was basically normal photos of people, and used it to learn two AIs. And after it learned, it would show like a picture of a paint stain. So the first one would say it's splash, paint splash, smidge, something like that. The other one would say blood, murder. You show it a picture of people laying in a field, and the first one would say picnic. The second one would say murder scene, bodies. So what I'm saying here is, besides that MIT successfully created the first psychologically unstable psycho AI, that it depends on the data. The biases that you provide with the data will make the AI learn in a certain way. So how do we ensure that the data is correct? Well, that's where blockchain comes into display. And I'll tell you in a second why that is important there. So blockchain in general is just like its name. It's a chain of different blocks connected together by a hash. Okay, what's that hash? So the hash is basically a one-way representation of your data. So if you have a ton of data, it will generate a fixed width string there for it. Does not matter if you have encyclopedia in here or you have my dissertation in there, it will generate the same length, but different numbers. If you change even one single letter in the input, it will change that number that comes out from it. So why is that important? Because remember those blocks that I talked about? So what a blockchain would do is, for the first block, it will create a hash and then will include that hash in the second block payload. So it will hash the entire thing, the information and the hash from the first one, and then use that in the next one, and therefore, and therefore, and therefore. What that means is, if I change anything in the first block, that hash will be busted out here, which will bust this one, which will bust the entire payload, which will bust this one, and then so forth and so on. So it means once you committed a block into the chain, you cannot change the block, otherwise it will interfere with the information in the hash and you can detect it. And blockchain is distributed. So that means that if you can change it on one chain or one node of that chain, you cannot change it on a lot of them. That's why you hear in the news a lot about 51 attacks. Why is that important? Because in a blockchain, the way that we make sure that it is correct, there is something called consensus algorithm. And in the consensus, you have to have more than 51% consensus that this block is true. So in order for you to change how it is, you have to change it in 51% of the nodes. So if the network is big and vibrant, like Ethereum, for example, you have tens of thousands of nodes and you cannot change all of them. This is important because in agriculture, you want to be able of sharing information with trust without sharing the information itself. Meaning that I'm working in my farm, I found something like the water is getting down. I don't want to share exactly that this is happening, but I want to share that information so everybody in the community would understand that in the system. So then when I first kind of like, started working on that, on how artificial intelligence would improve agriculture, productivity and sustainability, the interesting thing is I found a really insightful paper that was published, luckily for me, just in January by Lakshmi. And it basically, the title is exactly the title of this presentation. So what did they find? So what they found is that AI with IoTs are basically right now transforming the industry, making it where instead of farmers have to depend on guesswork or depend on tables of things that happen, they can get up to the minute information of what's going on in their farm and the farms around them, which then is pushed up the stream, allowing them to work together. How do they do that? With figuring out where do you apply fertilizers, where do you apply pesticides in the system, what kind of crops should you target right now, market conditions, as well as capacity that is going there, the yield and all of that is transformed into the AI predictive models, how that would work. Well, we've trained the AI like what I've explained a little bit earlier, and now it can take all of this data for what crops are going, what's the temperature, what are we predicting in the economic global markets, and send this data to you, which you may be able of acting on it if it is something that is quick, or you might not be able of acting in it if you already planted the crops, but at least you can figure out your strategy, whether you wanna sell to like frozen fruits or fresh produce, or think about different markets in those. Things like innovation in how the system are going. Today, we depend on labor. So agriculture is a labor-intensive industry where you have to hire a lot of seasonal labor. But with the innovations going on, adding the AI to robotics, allowing us to deploy those in the fields, which we could not do before. Why? Because a human can pick things much easier, but a robot needs to understand, is this fruit looks like it is ripe or not? Do I need to water this, or I don't need to water this? All of that was before very hard because you had to have rules, yes or no. But with AI, it can learn the conditions going on and can learn from other locations within the system. That is reflecting a lot on productivity in the farm. So now we can do more with less human power in it, and we can be specific to like different places. So instead of having to kind of like in some countries, they still flood irrigate. So you basically flood the entire field to irrigate. But now we don't have to. We can do it by drop irrigation. We can do smart irrigation, not only irrigating it blindly on a schedule, but irrigating it when the conditions allow for that. A simple analogy is your lawn, if it has an irrigation system and when it rains, there is an IoT connected with it that basically shuts the irrigation system so you don't have to irrigate. But imagine if it actually predicts the weather upcoming. Today, the irrigation systems in the homes have just a monitoring system that you set up the duration. The current ones in the field use weather predictions to vary the amount of irrigation and the time of it based on where you are, what kind of weather coming up, and whether I should irrigate now and how much to irrigate for, and the water level that is connected in the different rivers feeding this area. All of that is connecting together. That leads me to the last point there, which is sustainability. So we cannot manage our limited resources if we cannot measure them and learn from them. And the problems are so big and wide and complex that us humans by ourselves, we can't really work through those with a pen of paper. So AI is allowing us to take that, learn from them, and then helps us to augment our thinking capabilities so that we can use sustainable methods for agriculture. Where do you move your water supply? How do you move your produce, and making the best decisions of those. So enough of lots of talk, let's see some pretty pictures. So this is kind of like, all of those are from already existing projects and websites. So an example of that is when you are planting wide, big open fields, you need to measure the daylight, the temperature, the soil temperature itself, and the moisture in the plants. So you know when you would irrigate and when you don't have to irrigate the system. Things like drones. So in big farms, you have to like go and ride your car around and basically figure out what's happening with it. But right now you have drones that are both cheap, industrial, reliable, and there are also equipped with AI on them. So you would define the patterns where a drone would go. You would define how long it would stay on a certain location to look at it in regards of like how much battery power it has. So it's not even humanly operated. And there are stations where you have a station in a remote part of your farm connected with power, and all that the drone needs to do is a certain amount of times it will open up, fly around, get the scan, transmit the data back to the base, which is connected to your local server there that as an edge device calculates that and can either tell it to go back and recheck that piece or direct your irrigation system to a certain place that is deficient in water without you having to do all of the stuff, because you're sipping your coffee on the front porch and kind of like looking at what you're going to do when your yield increases on those. And that does not only apply outside, but also applies inside. So things like using robotics to pick, plant, and manage the crops itself, from things in an enclosed greenhouse or in the field on set up as an extension to a tractor that can go around, pick the fruit of a crop or plant new stuff, or apply pesticides in the right spot there that the drone has told it that it needs to happen over there, which is a big difference from having to say like, okay, we will in the old day will dust the entire crop using an aircraft that comes here. It does not distinguish anything, it just applies it everywhere, and you don't need all of that. It's both harmful for the environment and unnecessary spend, unsustainable. But if you know where are the problem areas, you can go and apply it to it, which requires lots of human to know that, or requires a lot of AI intelligence to be able of going and really addressing those pieces. And simple things like systems that would basically self-sustain. So you don't need even to have power in there. You could simply have a solar power system, because in order for you to grow anything, you need to have sun. So that's given. And the same thing, in order for you to have IoTs or any devices, you need to have power to them. You can use the same thing with the sun to power a device just enough to get that telemetry information and to push it out there. Not even that, you don't even need to have a cellular system, or you don't need to have an infrastructure. But some of the research that I've been working with allows for a big farm, which is remote in a situation that maybe it's a mountainside farming in there, like in Colombia, where you cannot really get to the farm or establish infrastructure, but drones can. So drones can not only provide telemetry data, but it can also approach a station that is solar powered on the side of a mountain, collecting data by itself and communicate with it and retrieve all the data back to the system in there. So that does not require setting up Wi-Fi towers or having any kind of power hooked to them. That is changing the paradigm of how we think through it. And this is, I'm glad to say that in North America, it's expected to account for the major share of AI by 2025, because we have large lands and we have a lot of demand on the food supply chain and explosive growth in the population. So you've made it, and thank you very much. I'm so glad that you are not here in person, so that you cannot throw tomatoes and other vegetables on me, pretending it's a part of the agriculture system. And I think we have enough time for some Q&A, so I wanted to stop now and see if you have any questions.
Well, of course, we're going to take advantage of grilling you on these hard topics. So,
be gentle, please.
So a starting point I wanted to ask you, in regards to the drones, do we need artificial intelligence to direct the drones, or going to the blockchain use cases, could that be something where smart contracts could direct the drones? Like, if you observe this, do that? or is it much more nuanced what AI can do than simply the smart contracts of the blockchain?
So that's a really good question. And the reason that I went through this grueling first half an hour is to make sure that all the bases are covered there with the different technologies so that we would know and understand how they can work together. So the first part of the drone itself, and luckily enough, there you go. So this is a small drone in here. So for me today to use this drone, I would need to fly it around myself. So that means there's a human that does that. If you have a big farm and you have, 100 of those drones, you will need to either divide them on people to fly them or have people to fly each of those drones. So you need to basically have some autonomous drones flying by themselves around the area. And then the other piece of there is that AI would be required to do is figuring out which area do I give it more time. So as a drone, you flew over and there's nothing interesting, so you came back. But what if there is a brown patch in the middle of the cornfield? So you need to investigate that more in it, and you need to spend more time there, given that you have limited fuel on board of that drone, so the battery would last for a certain amount of time. Or you go back to the base, recharge, come back, check this out, and decide from a classification point of view, those like different classifications, whether you should report that to a human kind of thing and say like, okay, it looks like abnormal, it's not the light angle, and it looks like, is it burned or is it pesticides, so that I can report on it correctly there. And so that's in the operation aspects of it, like just operating the drone, operating the system. Where blockchain comes in with a smart contract is where you would be basically, smart contracts are usually passive, and you need to invoke them with something to make sure that they execute on them. An example in this place is if you have a service running for doing pesticides that is servicing a whole group of farms, and the contract between you and them is on the blockchain. So there's a smart contract there. So the drone could self-order service for this piece of the land. So it will invoke that contract, say like, okay, I'm going to send in $10 for the service to come over and do the pesticides here. Similar to kind of like what the talk that we're hearing about your fridge will scan food coming in and out, and based on the amount of milk you have and your feeding patterns in it, it will pre-order milk for you in there. So if you give it access to your wallet, and the blockchain piece of it there allows this transaction of both the funds and the execution of it without humans have to go in, or without having to wonder, do we trust this guy? Do I send the money? Do I send the money? Because once the two systems are hooked in with a smart contract and you invoke it, it's irrevocable. It will work through all of the stuff. Another last thing that I will end up here with is a discussion that I was having yesterday actually around use of blockchain in supply chain, agriculture supply chain post the harvest and so forth. So if you are trying to ship a certain shipment that has to have regulations around kind of like, what kind of temperature it is set in and so forth. If the contract between the supplier and the big retail, for example, is done on the blockchain with connections to what we call in blockchain oracles to get that information from the IoTs, then the system will automatically invalidate a shipment if it either took longer or it has been exposed to high heat, higher than what has been agreed on at the beginning in there. So all of those can be done through the use of the smart contract upfront, and we don't have to worry about the whole sequence and the cycle of that.
Now, I'm going to warn you, we have actually a series of questions for you. Mm-hmm. So
rapid fire.
People who actually really want to hear more of what you've got to say, we might have to be concise, because this was concise for such a complicated topic. but what you've got to say is just too damn interesting. So there's too many people with questions for you. So I'm going to start off the list here. So the first one, the next one we have here in the list, rather, John was asking, do we know of an impactful farm management AI system? Like how much would that cost? Like say for a 12-hectare coffee farm or 300-acre corn farm? Like, and how much year to yearly are prices falling? I mean, assuming they're falling as technology gets better.
Yes.
We'll start with that one.
So I'm going to be very rapid on those questions to get as many of them as possible. So yes,
Great.
prices are falling, and there usually are also opportunities because of this data. So you need to understand the value of what you have. So for a farmer, the value of what you have is the data collected from the field. So what I would recommend is look at the other implementations in the area and bargain with the system around like, I'm going to provide you my data for you to do the analysis on all of the stuff in there. So I'm willing to open up more if you bring the system down or run a pilot on all of the stuff. The price is usually very dependent, not on the size per se, but on the amount of information you're going to collect. So how many IoTs you're going to deploy in the field in there, what kind of frequency you want to run all of that stuff with in it, and who do you connect that upstream with.
Okay. And then next we got some use cases for drones include the aerial displays, hundreds of drones functioning in a highly synchronized manner. Is that autonomous AI or is that simple programming?
That's a really good question. So how do you know the difference between them? The difference between them is if it is simple programming, the schedule would not change. It would be almost the same. They cannot react to anything that is happening, which is old school right now. Mostly anything that you're going to see on the market that is worth why right now has to have an AI component based on the data that comes in, meaning that it would learn from those patterns. Things like what happens if a drone is down? How do you cover that area with the remaining drones in there? What if there is an interest in there and you want to get more information around that piece? The drone system, the management system on top of all of the stuff should be able of directing the drones to go and do all of those without you having to interfere with it in there. So that's a good question also to evaluate a system that is somebody selling you on, whether it is rules-based, condition-based, through AI learning from the data, and always ask them, how does it react to new conditions and new data? If they tell you that, oh, you have to define all of the stuff upfront, then you know that you are getting the older system, not the newest things out there. As well as how do you link it to other input data? Because your farm is not in a planet by itself. It has to be linked to outside data. Without that, if it's not getting an update, then you'll be at a disadvantage, especially with weather, because drones are very dependent on weather. You don't want your 100 drones out there while a storm is coming in.
Right, because if they're just automated to just fly no matter what, and they fly at this hour, but they're not thinking, so to speak, of or knowing what the weather is. Wow, okay. Now, okay, so now the next couple are jumping around a little bit here. So is there a nexus between AI for agriculture and renewable energy? And is there a good way they can support each other?
So there is, and there is a distinction also. So AI is a utility. It's think of it as a new way of augmenting your abilities in your systems to work through things per se. And renewable energies is basically using renewable sources that not fossil based to generate more energy in the system. And where they both interact together are things like reducing your consumption of fossil or non-renewable energy sources there, or using AI in the generation of those. An example of that, in Egypt right now, they have huge solar farms that have been installed as projects in some areas of the country, which is hot enough for those. But when you put solar panels up there, you have an area underneath that is shaded. That area now is 10 to 20 degrees cooler than the area outside of that stuff. So it opens up abilities for planting different crops there. So you could use AI alongside the renewable energy to figure out how to do best use of the land that those different collection units will be at. Or things like in Holland, there's a lot of wind farms that are being set up there. And right now, I think Norway and Sweden are setting up the very first EU artificial island to collect wind energy from there. How do you manage the wind energy and the solar energy coming in with the required input from conventional systems that are using either nuclear power or coal or something like that to produce energy? You have to figure out where is the weather pattern coming in and what kind of power you would need and where do you spin it up. That's where the AI interacts with the renewable, interacts with the weather patterns, and the IoT is to collect all of that stuff.
Fantastic. Well, I'm certain we could probably keep going with hours of questions for you, but we have a combined question I'm going to ask, going through some points that Christine and John both make. They're kind of building on each other. And then we'll see after that if we close with that or if we have a few more minutes. But Christine asks, how helpful are machine learning frameworks like TensorFlow in speeding development, reducing implementation costs? And are there similar tools for the blockchain? There's danger of people using these tools without really understanding how they work or what they means. And just building off that from John, is how simple is the simplest impactful system that could be implemented? Do we have a case study for implementation in a low-tech, low-capital environment?
So those are really good questions in there. And yes, TensorFlows, binomials, finite Fourier transformation, all of those are basically mathematical models that we are using to build the system. So for TensorFlow, for example, when you are trying to go into cryptography and use those to basically arrive to functions that are basically complete, and in simpler terms, you would not be able to find a hack into reversing the encryption for those. And they are really, really important as tools. Do you need to understand it completely? No. But do you need to be aware of how it is built below it? Yes, because in my opinion, the more that you know about how all those pieces work together, the more that you have power to choose the right systems and how they would work. For example, a lot of people mix between blockchain and cryptocurrencies. So cryptocurrencies is an implementation of blockchain, but blockchain is far bigger than all of this stuff. It's kind of like the same analogy of thinking about a website and the internet. The internet protocol underneath it is quite far than that. Does everybody knows what TCP/IP is? Of course not. I studied it, but you don't need to do that. You can use the system. Another example is the email protocol that is used, the STMP or POP3 or any of those. Nobody knows about that, but everybody on the planet uses email on top of those. So knowledge is power, but you don't have to go deeper into those. You have to compare how those are implemented in the system. Acyclic graphs is another thing that you would need to look up in terms of the blockchain. For John's question about the simplest implementation of those, that's really neat. You could do something also by yourself. There are either kits out there, or you could link things together. The simplest thing, it depends on your particular situation. I'm very fond of linking weather patterns to irrigation in there. So with a simple controlled irrigation system and rainfall soil moisture detectors that you can put around, your 10-hectare farm or something like that, and collect this data, then you can control the water usage in it with a very simple program that is probably free. Hit me up for some of those. I can give you some links on them, but it's almost a DUI kind of like, system. You basically install those, link them together. It's a step up from your current irrigation system in there, but it would use the information coming from the weather pattern to predict whether, an example, the soil moisture right now is dropped to a low level that you need to irrigate for it. but there is rain coming tomorrow, so you don't really need to do that. So the probability of rain versus switching on your irrigation system, and which part of the land you should switch on your irrigation system on.
One final question to you. This is from Bob Castro. Aftermarket value for knowledge, not just data gained by machine learning and AI architectures. Could the insights from one farm operation be valuable to others, and how do you monetize that to optimize the return on investment?
So this question can be a session by itself. So,
so maybe we'll leave that for a future session, because
I'll
actually,
I'll
I
give
just
you.
want to throw in there, we actually do want to have follow-on webinars in the future, so we could plan this a couple of weeks from now.
Yes, no, I'm game for it. I love sharing knowledge, and I think kind of like what distinguish us as humans on this planet from all other different species is the ability for us to acquire, disseminate, and share knowledge between us. Knowledge is power. Without that, we cannot do progress and innovate. I'll touch a little bit about the issue here. So the information that you get from there, when you turn it into intelligence by you seeing the patterns and all of the stuff that's going on, is very valuable. And there is a market for all of the stuff, valuable on several things, valuable for the manufacturers of manufacturing the equipment going there. How does the system work? A lot of us engineers don't really understand the actual environment in the system until it is too late. In there. So we want to collect this data to improve and perfect how it works. Look at SpaceX and how many failed attempts before now they are successful. Tesla is the same thing. So the more that we understand how it works and how it fails specifically is very important for the manufacturing of those devices, the conditions and how they change in terms of the logical decisions. So if you can keep more of those data and negotiate that from a point of strength with them, that will be great. Similar for the suppliers, from seeds to pesticides to any of those stuff. Right now, you have general use, but you could come up with off-label use for those. I was presenting in a biomedical engineering conference, and one of the big topics there was that pharmaceutical companies that were able of discovering off-label use for current in circulation medications based on the chatter of the users that were talking about that. An example of that is aspirin. You could use it to fight kind of like low doses for cardiovascular, but it actually was a pain medication. So similarly here, your observations that are collected in the field using one type of fertilizers, one type of pesticides, one type of seeds, the combination of all of the stuff is valuable. So you can use that to monetize it back to the company originally. The other thing that is coming up nicely is those systems are usually sold for your farm, but there is an adjacent farm near you or farms across. So all of that information shared between them, because that the blockchain allows you to share data anonymously, then you could basically monetize that on a blockchain that allows you to share anonymous information. Like say, for example, this seed result is horrible out there, but it will confirm that you've used that seed because that seed was recorded on the blockchain. It's immutable that you actually got a large amount of it and you did not get any other type of seed. And you've reported that, but it could also omit who reported that in there. And hence you don't need to tell everyone that you've used it, but you could send the information and receive a reward out of that in a blockchain system there.
That sounds like a great concept of something that could be built. And can we throw a few more questions at you, because people just have a lot of questions for you still.
Sure, let's do it.
All right. So Christine just adds on to the last comment you responded to about Bob about recommendation systems. Mm-hmm. Larry added that we haven't spoke a lot yet about market table capacity for AI and blockchain and how the middleman costs of waste can be better managed. And then Bob just throws in there at the end as well about how the National Weather Services in the US and Mexico and other countries are really built a lot on individual farmers taking measurements and manually or analog reporting using their measurement equipment, and now how IoT tools can report this data. And more of a statement than a question. He just points out the possibilities are endless of what can be done with this.
Yes, there are ways to implement systems that are not necessarily fully automated. So one example of that I always like to give is that humans are very innovative. Back in Egypt, like 10 years ago, you would had to wait for like 6 months before having a phone line installed in your system. But today you can go buy a new cell phone line from the store downstairs. So that means that the revolution of technology together, your phone is actually an IoT device. So you could use that with a very simple application to collect the data between those farmers around there, and then feed it into an online system that would give all of them the results. So it's a information cooperative versus kind of like, just farming cooperative. Collect the information together and push it out together.
All right, fantastic. Do we have any last follow-up questions? If not, see, we've already got an agreement from Dr. Masuri to come back for another talk in the future. So we'll have more opportunities. And as John pointed out, there'll be more emails with plenty of questions. So
yeah, definitely. I'm very happy to answer your questions or jump on another call. That will be my pleasure.
All right, fantastic. Well, thank you once again for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Look forward to seeing you on some. And we have one more call coming up. We have one more tonight of lessons learned, and then tomorrow we'll have our closing ceremony.
Sweet.
All right.
Thank you, Peter. It was really great.
Good afternoon. Good evening. Thank you.